and Lieutenant Governor Bob Costra. So a Democrat and a Republican. We are staunchly nonpartisan, but like the League of Women Voters, we have positions on certain issues that we educate the public about and advocate for. The organization was founded by those two officials because they wanted to try to solve some of the biggest problems that they saw in Illinois politics. And what they saw at the root of not just Illinois politics, but national politics as well, was the increasing and concerning role of money in politics. At that time in 1997, campaign spending was getting bigger and bigger, nothing like what we're seeing right now. And what they saw both on the state and on the national level was that was interfering with the democratic process. It was distributing political power in a way that can harm ordinary people and concentrate power at the in the hands of just a few people. And it can distract elected officials from what we see in a healthy democracy as their main purpose, which is to pay attention to all of their constituents and not just to a select few. So that's why the organization was founded. We address a number of different issues that increase equity and accountability and responsiveness in government, all aimed again at increasing participation and a more representative and responsive democracy in Illinois. So we focus on campaign finance reform, as you mentioned, on ethics, which is important because, again, it's about representatives paying attention to their constituents and not necessarily paying attention to their own personal bank accounts or to somebody who can afford to, play the political game, and also to elections and election administration and making elections fairer and more accessible for everyone. So that's a brief overview of our organization. And again, I'm so glad to be here.
Wow, thank you so much. Now, as the Executive Director of Reform for Illinois, can you tell us, what do you do for Reform for Illinois?
I do everything. We're like many of the good governments and advocacy groups in the state. We're a very small but mighty shop. So I set the policy direction in collaboration with my board of directors. I set the policy direction, choose which issues to focus on and which policies to advocate for. I run the nuts and bolts of the organization. And if for example, we're advocating for a bill in Springfield or on the local level, I'll go and testify before legislative committees about our position on it, for example. So there's not much that I don't do. I wear many, many hats for Reform for Illinois. And it's one of the things I really like about it, actually, because it's varied and it's certainly never boring.
Amazing. Well, let's dive in. Our plan for today is we have a few questions that we're going to roll through, centering around the idea of campaign finance reform and, even getting into things like PACs. These were some questions that kind of came from our constituents, our base, and we got a number of them from many of you that are here on the phone. So we don't have an active chat going for this particular one. If something does come up, you can enter something in the chat, but that'll only be visible to the host. So we'll just spend the next 40 minutes or so rolling through these questions. Please make it conversational, and certainly if you have things that you'd like to share, you can for sure do that, Elisa. At least from a screen standpoint. So broadly speaking, what are the rules for disclosing campaign donations?
So in Illinois, anytime a candidate or a political committee receives $1,000 or more, they have to submit a disclosure. They have to submit that information to the Illinois State Board of Elections and publish it. They have to submit it within either 5 days if the election isn't coming up, or in 2 days if the election is coming up. And that information gets published immediately. It gets published on the Illinois State Board of Elections site or on Illinois Sunshine, which is our more usable campaign finance database. We also have a Twitter feed that will show every time one of those reports is filed, you can see where that $1,000 or more, sometimes much more, like the other night when Governor Pritzker put $90 million into his campaign account. That'll show up on our Twitter feed. Usually those big drops are Friday evenings, just if anybody is looking to track them. So we always know, just as we're settling in on Friday evening with a glass of wine or whatever, we gotta watch out for one of those big drops. So that is an ongoing transparency measure that really helps people keep track of where the big money is going. Donations smaller than that do not need to be released at that time. They need to be released on a quarterly basis. And that's these, you may have heard of famous quarterly reports. We usually put out an analysis when they come out. And that's when candidates publish not just all of their donations, whether they're $1,000 or more, $1,000 or less, which there are remarkably few of those, just to get that out there. Most donations in Illinois are big donations, or at least as a proportion of the overall money that goes into campaigns. So smaller donations have to go in there, and also expenditures, what the candidates are spending their money on, so where that money is going. We will know, the candidates have to itemize the donors, any donor who gives more than $150. But anybody who gives less than $150, those just go into a bucket of unitemized contributions. So we won't know who gives less than $150. The idea being that you assume that person doesn't have a great influence over the candidate, and so you don't necessarily have to know who that is. Now, whether that's actually true or not, it's hard to say. There's all kinds of studies that show that giving even small amounts of money, or even giving a pen to somebody, can create a sense of indebtedness. But that's the scheme that we have here in Illinois, and it's common in other states as well. Again, what you'll find when you do this research is often you'll be shocked at just how small those unitemized donations are. When we've studied it, it's usually, like, as a percentage in legislative races, usually a very small percentage in the low single digits, maybe 2 to 4%. In the Chicago mayoral race, it was about 1%, 1.5% of the funds of the overall money spent was from quote unquote small donors, $150 or less. And note also, that's not a very small amount of money, right? $150 is a lot for a lot of people, but very, very small role for small donors in most Illinois elections, especially in state elections and bigger elections like mayoral or the gubernatorial race, certainly.
And speaking of that, just maybe giving our listeners just a chance to understand that a little bit more. So less than 2% small, which means the rest is really coming from these very large donations. Can you speak a bit more about that? Like, what are the people? Who are the people? Are they corporations? Help us understand that.
Mm-hmm. It depends on the race, and it depends on the party. We actually did a sector analysis for the mayoral race of who was giving money, which industries were giving money to which candidates, and it was pretty fascinating. Labor in Illinois, when it comes to the Democratic Party, is huge, just an absolutely huge political player. Gigantic sums of money that come from labor organizations into Democratic coffers. Not just Democratic coffers, occasionally labor will donate to Republican candidates as well, but for the most part, the bulk of their power goes to the Democratic Party. On the side of other types of donors might be people in the real estate or commercial real estate industry, for example, or PACs that are formed by corporations or other associations of people. Big mega donors. We have a lot of rich people in Illinois. We have Ken Griffin, who could buy J.B. Pritzker maybe 8 times over at this point. I just read that he's worth about $28 billion at the moment, and Pritzker is worth a mere $3.5 or whatever it is. We've got, you know, billionaires like Sam Zell. We've got lots of billionaires in Illinois, and they use that money. And so you'll see large donations from wealthy individuals, also from PACs associated with corporations or business associations, from labor unions, and certainly, and also from other candidates and from political party committees. And we can talk about that a little bit more, but candidate committees can transfer pretty large amounts between each other. And so what we'll see often, for example, is the legislative leaders, say Senate President Don Harmon, Speaker Chris Welch, Senate Minority Leader Brady, and Minority Leader Jim Durkin, sorry. They'll collect large amounts of money, particularly the Democrats. The Democrats tend to vastly outraise their Republican counterparts in Illinois. They'll collect huge amounts of money and then distribute them either to candidates who they support or to their political party committees, which in turn then distribute the money, to candidates and causes that they support. This might be a little into the weeds, but it's a really important thing to mention, which is that in Illinois, we have a very unique feature in our campaign finance system we call it the self-funding loophole, or the millionaire's exemption, or the money bomb. And what that is that when someone either gives or loans their own campaign a significant amount of money for state and local for legislative and local races, it's $100,000. For statewide races like governor, it's $250,000. When one candidate in that race gives or loans themselves that money, all contribution caps come off in the race. So that means that donors can now give unlimited amounts of money to every candidate in that race. And what that means is that essentially we have no campaign contribution rate caps in many races, not all certainly, but in some really key races. The legislative leaders, those 4 people that I mentioned, they have used this loophole for the past several years. The only one who hasn't used it this year is Jim Durkin, the House Minority Leader, the Republican House Minority Leader. They will loan themselves that $100,000, take in huge amounts of money from whether it's Ken Griffin on the Republican side, or labor on the Democratic side, or J.B. Pritzker on the Democratic side, and they'll take in all of that money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and either give that to a political party, which has a lot more latitude without and looser caps on what they can give to other committees, or they'll distribute it themselves. And what this has become is a way for a small number of people, like the legislative leaders, to not only consolidate their own power, because having that money, controlling those purse strings, gives them a lot of control over their party and their caucuses, but also to magnify the power of big mega donors, because now those donors can give so much more money than they could without that device being used. And then they'll pay themselves back the money. So we've offered several policy proposals to try and fix this. The loophole actually came from a good instinct in a way, which was that because of the way the Supreme Court has interpreted the First Amendment, we're not able to put restrictions on what people can spend of their own money personally. So J.B. Pritzker could spend as much money as he wants on his race. There's no way we can stop that. And so the idea was that if he's running against someone who doesn't have those deep pockets, at least we can enable that opponent to raise large amounts of money in big increments rather than having to scramble around for $5,000 or $6,000, what's the current limit, increments of money. So it was meant to level the playing field between wealthy and non-wealthy candidates, but most of the time, the way we see it used is to circumvent campaign contribution limits and consolidate the power of a few of the legislative leaders and other key players in the Illinois ecosphere. So I hope that was a lot that I just gave you. So I hope that wasn't confusing, or that I explained it well. If anybody has any questions, or Kelly, you think there's something that I can clarify, please let me know. But I do think it's really important for people to understand that unique feature. We're the only state in the union that has it, that unique feature of our elections. And it's one of the reasons that the costs of Illinois elections are so high, and that often we don't have that safeguard of contribution caps in place.
It's fascinating. We can go in a lot of different directions. What I am going to ask, though, is a little bit more about, since that is unique to Illinois, and it just so happens that our Pritzker and others are billionaires. So what is this battle of the billionaire? Can you talk about that a little bit more, and what that means for us here in the state of Illinois?
I think it's extremely disturbing, and everybody should be concerned about this. What we've gotten ourselves into is this vicious cycle where the perception is that only a billionaire can beat a billionaire, can beat a billionaire, can beat a billionaire. So we had Rauner, and then, Pritzker came in kind of on his white horse to be able to counter Rauner's money. Now Rauner has, gone away, but he's come back a bit into the fray recently. But we've got Ken Griffin with, his 8 times the net worth, or whatever it is, of J.B. Pritzker. And, Pritzker put in I believe it was about $176 million to win his race in 2018. He has put in so far $135 million into his reelection campaign, just so far, and things are just getting warmed up in the gubernatorial race. Ken Griffin has said that he will put up to $300 million to defeat J.B. Pritzker. And so what kind of democracy do we have here, where essentially we've got a very, very small, we're talking about, a very small handful of people who are controlling the political conversation at the highest levels of our state politics. And we saw this battle play out, for example, in the progressive tax debate, right? Where Pritzker would put in, tens of $1 million, and then Ken Griffin, these were more Friday night drops, right? And then Ken Griffin would put in that much, and then Pritzker would put in more. They ended up putting in almost exactly the same amount of money. Ken Griffin won that battle. But again, we have just two people, largely controlling the political conversation, controlling what you see on your TV, or in your Facebook feed. It's very disturbing. And it would be disturbing to have any 2 people controlling the political conversation, right? Just even if they were the 2 best people in the world, that's just not the kind of democracy, participatory democracy, that we want to have. But what's particularly concerning when very wealthy people control the conversation is that very wealthy people overall, and there have been studies about this, and of course there are exceptions, and I don't want to say at all that there aren't wealthy people with good intentions and who are selfless and trying to make the world a better place. I don't want to say that at all. But overall, there have been studies that show that wealthy people have, in many ways, different interests than ordinary people like you and me. They just don't have a lot in common financially, certainly, with people like you and me. And studies have shown that they've used their money and their political power not just to give themselves more political power, but to help enact policies that will further enrich them. And what that does is increase what we already have, which is a growing problem of social inequality. It just entrenches that inequality into the political system, writes it into our laws, and makes it that much harder for to break out of that cycle. So again, we've got a vicious cycle here where very wealthy people are exercising political power to make themselves wealthier and to create rules that will enable them to have even more political power. And this is happening. We see it on, it can happen on both sides of the aisle. I know people who will say it's happening more on one side of the aisle than other, but it can certainly happen on both sides of the aisle. And it's very, very concerning. And everybody should be worried about this, and everybody should be trying to think of ways to educate themselves on this problem and to figure out how we can do more to empower ordinary people. I hate to use the word ordinary because but everyday people like you and me, to amplify their voices and make sure that we don't get drowned out by these like very small number of people with very, very big megaphones.
And to that point, is that something you feel that campaign finance reform can really help us with, is getting the voices of the ordinary people like you and me, the everyday people, more heard?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really glad you asked about this, because there's tons of talk about the problem of money in politics. If you ask anybody, just anybody will say, and there's been polling on this, and they'll say it in both parties, there's too much money in politics. And our politicians are bought and sold. People know instinctively that it's a problem, but there's very little talk about solutions. And I will tell you, just from a realist point of view, that the Supreme Court in recent years has put serious constraints on our ability to deal with the problem of money in politics. They've interpreted the First Amendment so broadly, and their view of what interests can balance the First Amendment, they've narrowed it to a very, I think, constricted and crimped conception of corruption, with basically quid pro quo corruption, and have ignored all of the effects that the distribution of financial power can have on the political system that I've been talking to you about. And because of decisions like Citizens United, because of way back in the 70s, Buckley versus Vallejo, that said that we can't put restrictions on personal spending of campaigns, because of decisions like that, we have way fewer tools in our toolbox than we would like to have. However, we do have some, and they are being used across the country. So just here in Illinois, I'll say, some of the big problems that we have: reforming the self-funding loophole so we can curb some of the biggest abuses with that. There's more technical stuff about party transfers, and again, trying to just prevent that hyper consolidation of power that we saw during the Madigan era, and that we're seeing starting again now. We're kind of seeing a continuation of similar dynamics. But one powerful tool that they've used in jurisdictions across the country is public financing of campaigns. And, there's a couple different ways to do that. One is in Seattle, for example, they call them democracy dollars or democracy vouchers, where they distribute, the city will distribute publicly funded vouchers to voters, who can then give those vouchers to the candidate of their choice. Another version of that's a lot more common and has been used for decades, really. It's used in New York City very successfully, is small donor matching. And that will be like you give, let's say, $10 or $50 to a candidate of your choice. The jurisdiction will match that contribution by some set factor, and in the city of Denver, it's a factor of 9. So the $50 contribution will become a $500 contribution. And all of a sudden, people with those lower than $150 donors, everyday people, have the power to make a real impact on a candidate's chances and get involved. And the candidate can rely more on ordinary people than they have to rely, say, on big donors. And these are voluntary programs. Because of the Supreme Court, we cannot make them mandatory. So anybody can, you know, where they have these programs, you can opt into them. You accept usually certain restrictions on what you raise and from where. And they've been shown to dramatically increase donor diversity, the type of people who donate, socioeconomically, ethnically, across the board, and also to change the type of candidates that can run. Some of you have heard of Letitia James in New York State. She's the Attorney General in New York State. She won her first office because of public financing, and she's become a big advocate for it because she says she wasn't personally wealthy. She didn't know any wealthy people. She didn't have, you know, party insider support. And yet, because of the public financing program, she was able to run her campaign, fuel her campaign on donations from ordinary people who believed in her. And that launched her career. And because of that, she was also able to pay more attention to their concerns, instead of paying attention to the concerns of the richest people, you know, they can find in the phone book, she can all of a sudden pay attention to the concerns of her constituents who need her most. Now, are we going to, I will say also that this can help not just release candidate dependence on mega donors, but it can release candidate dependence on the party establishment, right? Because, for example, as I was talking to you before, those party leaders who hold a tremendous amount of funds, if you give candidates something like public financing where they can have an independent base of funding, where they're accountable to ordinary people, that will give them the ability to stand on their own 2 feet. So if you're looking for ways to prevent the extreme consolidation of power among the hands of a few, public financing can be a really great tool. So there's a number of things like that we can use to amplify the voices of people who otherwise might get drowned out by some of these fire hoses of money, you know.
Sounds like, I mean, it's not, and in the state of Illinois, these optional programs that you're describing, they're not available.
No, although here in Evanston, we are pushing for one for a pilot program for mayoral races. And so we're hoping to have a pilot program, if all goes well, we're hoping to have a pilot program here that then can be expanded or can become a model for other jurisdictions.
Fantastic. So speaking of just where the money's coming from, specific to Illinois, is there an easy way for us to understand where these mega donations, but any donations, are really coming from in a campaign?
I'm glad you asked that. Yeah, Reform for Illinois runs a campaign finance database called Illinois Sunshine. And some of you may have heard of it or used it. And I can show you how, should I share my screen now? Is now a good time?
That'd be great.
Okay, let me see. Okay, you can see my screen, right? So let me.
It's blue. Yep, there we go. Got it.
Here we go. Here we go. So here's our Sunshine database. It was the first website of its kind in the country. And we pull information from the Illinois State Board of Elections and make it easy for you to search. So let's take somebody easy. Let's look at JB Pritzker. You can just type him into the search there. And here we go. You can look at some recent donations right here. Here are some of his most recent donations. You can see, for example, that he gave $5,000 to the 40th Ward Democratic Organization. And then you can see here, JB Pritzker gave JB for governor $90 million on January 14th. You can see that he gave a little bit of money to this Mason County Democratic Central Committee. And then again, on March 12th of 2021, he gave himself $35 million. And you can see all the money that he's given himself. And Vote Yes for Fairness was his progressive tax initiative. So if you click on his name here, you'll see this is who he is. Here's these are committees that he's associated with. The Democratic Governors Association, his Political Action Committee, and a candidate committee, JB for Governor. You can click on JB for Governor. And this will give you some information. Here you can see his top donors. Obviously, he has been by far his top donor. So far, altogether, across his elections, he's given himself $303 million. And then these are some smaller, but $100,000 donations he's gotten from some other people or groups. You can see the top 25 expenses that he's made. $62 million to this Johnson Shore Strategic Media, Magnus Johnson Shore, I don't know, Strategic Media Company. $18 million to Pure 91 Media, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a really powerful tool for you to you can explore, and you can go down rabbit holes with it. I think you were asking, for example, about Naperville PACs in Naperville and how they seem to be proliferating recently. I believe one that was mentioned was Naper PAC. So you can just type in Naper PAC, you can see it here. You can see that cash on hand as of the last quarterly report was $38,000. And you can see in their top 5 donors that the top donor was Grant Wehrle's campaign account. Citizens to Elect Grant Wehrle donated $55,000 to this PAC, and the second biggest donor is Dick Uihlein, another well-known, generally conservative billionaire donor. So, and you can see here the officers that Grant Wehrle is the chair and the treasurer of that PAC. So those are, just a little bit of the neat things that you can do with Illinois Sunshine, but it's a great way to explore who is trying to influence your elected officials and who's trying to influence you. Here, now you can go down the rabbit hole of Richard Uihlein and see things he's been giving money to: the Northwest Side GOP Club, Liberty First PAC, Safe Suburbs for USA, et cetera, et cetera. So I will stop sharing now. So that's a great way to educate yourself on who is, again, trying to influence your candidates and your elected officials, and who's got the big power in your community.
I'm just curious if there's money left over after the campaign, ends. What happens to that money?
That's a good question. A lot of different things can happen to it. It can get transferred to other candidate committees, or party committees, which is common. It can get donated to nonprofits. It can get sometimes returned to donors if that's what they want. So there's a number of things that can happen to it. And a lot of people do hold on to their candidate committees for a long time, either because they want to, see if a cause comes up that they want to give that money to, or because they're thinking they might run again sometime down the line.
Mm. So interesting, and thank you for sharing that. I mean, it's learning so much tonight. Just the ability the transparency and the visibility, I think, is kind of step one, awareness, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
You did mention PAC, and PAC has been something that I know our organization has been more and more curious about. Can you just start with a brief definition? What is a PAC?
A PAC is a political committee that's set up by, it could be a corporation, it could be a business association, it could be a political figure, it could be any number of people. And it's a political committee that does have to report their donations. And they do have limits around them. They're usually high limits. Actually, do you mind if I share my screen one more time?
Absolutely.
Because I just wanted to give you an idea of what the limits look like in Illinois. Can you see that?
We can.
Okay, so you can see that a candidate can accept $6,000 from an individual. They can accept $12,000 from a corporation. Note that in Illinois, candidates can accept money from corporations. They cannot do that at the federal level or in many states. And that causes some issues, including transparency issues in Illinois. And look, they can collect almost $60,000 from another candidate political committee. Remember, I told you that candidates often switch money between their accounts, or a political action committee. So a political action committee, an individual can only give a candidate $6,000. A political action committee can give a candidate political committee $60,000. A political party committee, again, has higher limits, still has limits, but has higher limits. $12,000 from an individual, $24,000 from a corporation. Note, no limits on contributions from other political party committees, and no limits on transfers between state political party committee. And so these areas where there are no limits, again, you see up here, that a candidate can receive unlimited amounts of money from a political party committee. So remember when I was telling you that legislative leaders might funnel money into a political party committee, then that political party committee can give, as long as there's not the primary condition here, can give unlimited amounts to a candidate. So it just opens the floodgates there. And so political action committees can receive $12,000 from an individual, $24,000 from a corporation, and $60,000 from another PAC or a political candidate committee. So that's what a PAC is. A PAC, oh my goodness, something very strange happened to my Zoom.
We can see you just fine.
Okay, everybody's off center. So PACs are formed to advance ideas and to support candidates. They can explicitly support candidates, they endorse candidates, they give money to candidates. So they'll often be formed by people or entities that have a common purpose. And that's what PACs are. Again, they do have to list their donors, but just like with anybody who can accept corporate donations, you have the problem that corporations don't necessarily have to list their donors. And so while we might know what corporation donated to a PAC or a candidate, we don't know who is involved in that corporation. And that could include a nonprofit corporation, for example, that's contributing money. So that's a big hole in our transparency regime.
So are PACs good or are PACs bad?
It depends on where you're standing, right? And whether you believe in the cause of the PAC or not. I think, you could definitely argue that they're a valuable way for people to get together and pool their resources to work for a cause that they believe in or that helps their self-interest. And in that sense, they're a perfectly legitimate exercise of democracy. As with everything else, the problems arise when either, again, you have shadow donors, you don't know where the money is coming from, or when, the finances and the political power become so out of whack and distributed so kind of lumpily is the wrong word, but when the financial power is distributed so unequally, that's when you start getting into problems with any of these organizations. And also sometimes the relationships between, say, elected officials and PACs and industries, they can get they're often very complicated, and they can provide ways you sometimes get into a sort of a shell game that almost looks like money laundering, where you're moving money from different accounts through PACs and so you know, when you start to get into that mess, there's certainly problems can arise. But I don't think that we can say that there's anything inherently wrong with having a mechanism for people to pool their resources to achieve a political goal.
So are we hearing that, you know, they're a bit of an impediment to the transparency and the visibility that something like the Sunshine database is providing us? Are PACs, like maybe unintended, but are PACs kind of impediments to campaign fairness?
Anytime that you have the ability for corporations to donate. So on the federal level, only individuals can donate to candidates, for example. And so you know who an individual is. Anytime you have a situation where corporations can donate, and that includes, you know, may include some other types of organizations, you don't necessarily know where that money is coming from, because corporations don't necessarily have an obligation. We actually are working, we have a bill that would require corporations or any organization that puts large amounts of money into a political committee to say where that money is coming from. But right now, that's not what we have in Illinois. And so there is definitely the opportunity for some shadowy operators to get involved without our ability to find out who actually is behind the spending.
Is it possible for foreign countries or foreign entities to contribute to, you know, an American, let's just say an American, not even the state of Illinois, political campaign through like a PAC or even on
It is not. And the idea behind that is that, and you saw this arrives in the Trump administration, right? Whether they were seeking an in-kind contribution from Russia. Anyway, that was complicated, but no. And the idea is that foreigners should not be able to influence American elected officials. So no, you cannot. However, the Federal Election Commission, the FEC, recently ruled, and this was very controversial, that foreign entities can contribute to ballot initiative committees. So and the idea again was that there wasn't the same type of danger of corruption because a ballot initiative is not a person who could give a quid pro quo. A lot of people were very upset with that decision because they don't feel that foreign entities should be able to pay to influence American voters. But that was the FEC's ruling. So unless that changes, that's the current state of the law.
So back to reform for Illinois and the Sunshine database and providing the visibility, what about accountability? What happens when the rules are broken? Who's monitoring that? And tell us a little bit about like what happens. Are there penalties?
There are. I will say that in Illinois, and I don't know how it is elsewhere, the State Board of Elections is in charge of adjudicating complaints. Like for example, an individual or an organization, we have brought campaign finance complaints alleging that candidates or entities have violated Illinois campaign finance laws. There'll be a hearing in front of the State Board of Elections. Generally, the State Board of Elections tends to be pretty lenient, acknowledging that people often make mistakes, that campaign finance law is complicated, et cetera, et cetera. But there are fines. They may be, you know, somebody might have to give their campaign contributions back if it was, say, in excess of the permitted amount, for example. And there are the state board does have the ability to levy civil fines. Now you can also get into criminal issues. For example, if you're talking about something that reaches the level of fraud or bribery, you've seen this, and misuse of campaign funds can be considered fraud. I don't know how many of you followed a recent case that's ongoing. He was a state senator who ran for governor in the Republican primary, Sam McCann. I think did he eventually run for independent? I'm not sure. Anyway, his name was Sam McCann, and he's been indicted for using campaign funds to buy personal items, including things like an RV, and I believe there was another vehicle. And that's a federal case that's being brought against him. And in that case, he could face many years in prison if he's convicted. So a case like that, or if they can prove actual bribery, you can end up with criminal charges. But I would say that's fair. That's fair.
Say that again. I'm sorry, you just broke up.
So that's rare.
That's rare. Gotcha. I thought you said that's fair. It's like,
no.
We have a few questions that have come through just to the host here, so I'll go ahead and I'll cover them. And they are back on PACs. So we do have a fair amount of our base just really interested in PACs. Can you talk about the difference between a super PAC and a PAC?
Yeah. So a PAC, as I mentioned, is usually subject to contribution limits, et cetera, et cetera. A super PAC is not. A super PAC, as most people probably associate super PACs with the Citizens United case and with some subsequent cases that enabled their creation, super PACs can raise unlimited amounts of money. They cannot be subject to contribution caps, and they can spend unlimited amounts of money. And that's why they are so controversial. The difference between a PAC and a super PAC is that a PAC, as I mentioned, can endorse candidates, can give money to candidates, can coordinate publicity efforts with candidates. A super PAC cannot. Many people say that that's a very hard line to police and that a lot of kind of winking and nodding goes on. But a super PAC is not ever supposed to talk to a candidate. They can support a candidate, and they can run ads supporting a candidate, for example, but they're not ever supposed to talk to the candidate and coordinate with them about their activities or spend money in coordination with them. So they're called independent. Super PACs make what's called independent expenditures, that is independent of the candidate that they may be supporting or opposing. I mean, obviously it would be independent of the candidate they're opposing, but independent of the candidate that they're supporting. And again, the idea here, it's based on the Supreme Court's very narrow conception of corruption as being really a quid pro quo corruption. We give you money, you give us, favorable legislation, for example. And the idea was that because super PACs are not giving money to or in-kind donations in the form of publicity or anything like that to a candidate, then you don't have that risk of quid pro quo corruption. Now, a lot of people might say, and maybe you're saying this, wouldn't a candidate kind of naturally feel indebted to a super PAC that spent millions of dollars, or to the people involved with a super PAC that spent millions of dollars to support them? And that would be a good question to ask. And plus, there's been a lot of questions raised again about what's coordination, how do you really define it? Is there wink, wink, nod, nod going on between? It's kind of like this barely veiled dance between super PACs and candidates, for example. But the fact that super PACs can raise those huge amounts of money are one of the key factors that's caused the explosion in political spending since Citizens United came about. Not that spending wasn't already a huge problem. Remember, we were founded in 1997, concerned about the rise in political spending. Citizens United wasn't until 2010. But this idea that they can spend unlimited amounts of money, what that does is ratchet up the arms race. So it's not just super PACs competing against super PACs. Now candidates have to compete against super PACs. A candidate who is constricted by contribution limits, now has to, well, unless the self-funding loophole, a candidate now has to raise money to be able to counter the messages that a super PAC is putting out, for example. And so Citizens United and the resulting super PAC phenomenon have really ratcheted up the campaign spending arm race in the United States. And that's one of the reasons, I believe, along with the rise in social inequality and the proliferation of, kind of ultra wealthy individuals, that's contributed to the types of problems that we're seeing now. I will say that, like PACs, super PACs, although unlike PACs, super PACs can take in unlimited amounts of money. Like PACs and like candidates, they do have to list their donors. But again, we have this problem that if you have corporations or certain types of nonprofit organizations donating to a super PAC, you don't necessarily know who's investing the money in that entity. And that is where we get into the issue of dark money, because there are all sorts of elaborate shell games that go on in order to hide who is actually putting money into a super PAC. So that's how the super PAC thing fits in with dark money. Some people are surprised to hear that super PACs do have to list their donors, and that's good, but it's only a piece of the puzzle, and it leaves basically this big gaping loophole for shenanigans to occur.
Right. Interesting. If you don't mind, we've just got a few questions that I'd love to just address with you, and then I would like to turn it over to you to just share some upcoming events and messages that I know you wanted to share with our group here today. So let me ask, this is again on PACs, but specific to the Sunshine database, when you do search PACs on Sunshine, Illinois, does it only grab the ones with Illinois in the name? IL?
No, any PAC that you find in Illinois Sunshine will be an Illinois-based PAC, because Illinois Sunshine we don't carry federal data. For federal data, you'll have to go to like opensecrets.org, for example. You can track down federal donations. So for example, you won't see on Illinois Sunshine donations to a congressional candidate, for example, because that's a federal race. You'll only see state and local races, and so you'll only see state and local PACs.
Great, thank you. There's another question about, is there a clearinghouse of all Illinois PACs that's searchable?
There might be on the State Board of Elections site, or they may even be a feature on our site, but it's not like popping out at me. But what you can do is just search, Political Action Committee or PAC, and many times it will come up in the name.
Awesome. And then a specific question, good one here. If a person registered as, Jane Doe were to donate $100, but do it multiple times, let's say, 6 times or something like that, does it show up as 106 different times, or does it sum the total donation under that individual?
That's a great question, and it reminds me actually of a story about, again, it's amazing how creative people get to hide their money. Your $600 donation will probably show up as a $600 donation if it's within the quarterly reporting period, because it's over $150 cumulatively. So it would show up that way. It might show up in multiple donations, but they would have to report that you gave it to them. The fact that you gave it in $100 increments is not going to protect your identity. However, I did hear a case once where a landlord in Chicago was making donations to an alderman they supported in $999 increments to avoid the $1,000 triggering reporting amount. So remember, at $1,000, anything $1,000 or more needs to get reported immediately, while anything below that gets reported in quarterly reports. So this landlord didn't want their name out there before the end of the election. So in the run up to the election, they gave many $999 donations just to avoid that $1,000, to avoid having their name reported. So their involvement didn't come up until after the election, when the quarterly reports were due. The other thing this donor did was, he was a real estate, a landlord, as I said, and he had different LLCs for each of his properties. and he used a different LLC for each donation. So that made it harder. Eventually a reporter did piece it together, but that made it harder to figure out, like for ordinary, Joe Schmo looking the information up, who was behind that spending. So this is the kind of thing that that creative donors can do if they really don't want their information out there.
Incredible, incredible. So I want to say thank you so much, Elisa, for your time and for sharing all of your knowledge about this. I know I've learned so much. I know I wanted to give you just a few minutes to talk to our league about your upcoming events and maybe some things our members might be interested in hearing about.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me talk so much about this issue that I'm really passionate about. Like I said, I don't think there's anything more important than knowing and understanding who is trying to influence you as a voter and as a member of your democracy, and who is trying to influence your elected officials. And understanding where the money is going and coming from is absolutely crucial to your participation in a healthy democracy. So thank you for being here and spending all of this time listening to this highly technical stuff. Upcoming events, we have a number of different series, but no exact dates yet. One of our series is on the role of money in politics in certain issues. So as many of you will know, there's no issue that you care about that isn't affected by the flow of money in politics. We held one in December about the role of special interest money and big donors in environmental and energy policy, and that will be an ongoing series with different issues, for example. We've also held a forum on the property tax assessment process, which I know is something that sounds terrible, but affects all of us very deeply. And I hope that that will be part of an ongoing series. So we have a lot of things in the hopper, no exact dates yet, but if you're not already on our mailing list, please sign up for it at reformforillinois.org. And you'll get all of our invitations to events. And we also send out our research and statements, our legislative agenda, things like that through that mailing list.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, Elisa, for your time. This was inspiring. I really appreciate it. I just have a couple of closing remarks for the rest of our league members on the line here. So next Monday, the League of Women Voters is going to be 102 years old. So we'll be celebrating online, and we'll be honoring the suffragettes who were silent sentinels with a reenactment on Monday, noon to 1 at the Free Speech Pavilion across from the Nichols Library. All righty. Well, on Wednesday, March 9th is another session just like this one, except we'll be interviewing Sophia McDonald of the Legacy Museum. So from enslavement to mass incarceration. So that'll be another very interesting discussion that we'll be having March 9th. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Thank you and have a great night.